This document serves as a comprehensive analysis of the individual known throughout military and intelligence circles as Voidwalk, whose transformation from a promising cadet to the most feared operative in known space represents both our greatest triumph and our most dangerous failure. What began as an experimental training program designed to create the ultimate soldier has evolved into something far beyond our original parameters, raising questions not only about the nature of strength and destruction, but about the very foundations upon which we build our warriors. The subject's journey embodies a fundamental truth that has echoed through military philosophy for millennia. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. However, the practical application of this principle has yielded consequences that extend far beyond the scope of any single military operation or strategic objective. We have created not merely a weapon, but a force of nature that operates according to its own inexorable logic. The implications of this case extend throughout every level of our defense infrastructure, from basic training protocols to the highest levels of strategic planning. The methods employed in creating Voidwalk have fundamentally altered our understanding of human potential, psychological conditioning, and the delicate balance between creating effective operatives and maintaining control over them. This document represents an attempt to catalog not only the observable facts of this transformation, but to understand the philosophical and practical frameworks that made such an evolution possible. Through exhaustive analysis of training records, psychological evaluations, mission reports, and first-hand accounts from surviving personnel who encountered the subject during various phases of development, we have constructed what we believe to be the most complete picture possible of how silence, isolation, and systematic destruction of weakness can forge something that transcends conventional military classification. The subject represents a new category of threat entirely, one that exists not merely as a tactical consideration, but as a strategic reality that shapes the very nature of how we conduct operations across multiple sectors of space. The three phases of development documented herein, the foundation of silence, the crucible of transformation, and the emergence as a galaxy-class threat, represent a progression that was both inevitable given the training parameters and unprecedented in its scope and consequences. Each phase built upon the previous one, creating a cascade of psychological and physical adaptations that pushed the subject beyond the boundaries of what we previously understood to be possible for a human operative. What emerges from this analysis is not merely the biography of a single individual, but a case study in the extreme limits of human conditioning and the unforeseen consequences of pursuing absolute tactical advantage without regard for broader strategic implications. The subject's evolution demonstrates that in the pursuit of creating the perfect weapon, we may have instead created something that operates entirely outside the framework of traditional military command and control structures. Part 1. The Foundation of Silence. The origin story of the operative known as Voidwalk begins not with violence or dramatic revelation, but with the kind of methodical, clinical precision that characterizes all truly effective military conditioning programs. Recruited at age 16 from the outer colonies of the Kepler sector, the individual who would eventually earn the designation of Galaxy-class threat displayed no extraordinary physical capabilities, no remarkable intellectual gifts, and certainly no indication of the psychological transformation that would follow. The selection process itself was unremarkable by contemporary standards. Colonial recruitment officers were tasked with identifying individuals who demonstrated what internal documentation referred to as adaptive resilience under pressure, combined with minimal external dependency factors. In practical terms, this meant finding young people who had survived difficult circumstances while maintaining psychological stability, and who lacked strong social or family connections that might interfere with the intensive conditioning process that lay ahead. The subject fit these parameters perfectly. Orphaned during a mining accident at age 12, they had survived 4 years of subsistence living on a frontier world where resource scarcity and environmental hazards created a natural selection pressure for individuals capable of thriving in isolation. Colonial records indicate a pattern of self-reliance that bordered on complete social detachment, combined with an almost preternatural ability to remain calm and focused under extreme stress. These characteristics, which might have been considered concerning in a civilian context, represented exactly the raw material that military psychologists believed could be shaped into something extraordinary. The initial training facility, designated as Research Station Omega-7, was located in the void between star systems, accessible only through heavily encrypted jump coordinates that changed on a rotating schedule. The isolation was not merely a security measure, but a fundamental component of the conditioning process itself. Every aspect of the environment was designed to reinforce the central principle that would guide the subject's development: Strength could only emerge through the complete destruction of weakness, and weakness was fundamentally rooted in dependency on external validation, support, or connection. From the moment of arrival, the subject was stripped of name, personal history, and any identifying characteristics that might serve as anchors to their previous existence. They became simply Candidate 7, one of 12 individuals selected for what internal documents referred to as the Absolute Conditioning Protocol. The other candidates would serve multiple purposes throughout the program, as training partners, as sources of competition and motivation, and ultimately as measures of the subject's progress as they gradually surpassed, outlasted, or eliminated each of them through the natural progression of increasingly demanding trials. The physical environment of the training facility was designed to enforce complete sensory and social isolation whenever the subject was not actively engaged in structured activities. Living quarters consisted of featureless metal compartments, barely large enough for a single person to lie down, with no windows, no personal possessions, and no communication devices of any kind. Meals were delivered through automated systems at irregular intervals, ensuring that even the basic rhythms of hunger and satisfaction could not provide comfort or predictability. The silence was absolute and enforced through both architectural design and strict behavioral protocols that made any unnecessary sound or communication grounds for immediate punishment. This systematic isolation served multiple psychological purposes that became evident only as the program progressed. By removing all external sources of comfort, validation, or distraction, the subject was forced to develop internal resources for maintaining psychological stability. The absence of social interaction eliminated the natural human tendency to define oneself in relation to others, forcing the subject to construct their identity entirely through their own capabilities and achievements. Most importantly, the silence created a psychological environment where the subject's own thoughts became their primary companions, leading to an introspective focus that would prove crucial in the later stages of conditioning. The training itself began with seemingly mundane exercises in physical endurance, technical skill development, and tactical problem-solving. However, each component was designed to reinforce the central psychological framework being constructed through the environmental conditioning. Physical challenges were structured not merely to build strength or improve reflexes, but to teach the subject that pain, exhaustion, and physical limitation were simply obstacles to be overcome through mental discipline. The progression of difficulty was carefully calibrated to ensure that the subject was constantly operating at the very edge of their capabilities, creating a psychological state where normal limits seemed increasingly irrelevant. Technical training followed similar principles, with the subject required to master increasingly complex systems and technologies under conditions of extreme stress, time pressure. The goal was not merely to create technical competency, but to establish a mindset where uncertainty and chaos became comfortable operating environments. Each success was met with an immediate escalation of difficulty, ensuring that the subject never had the opportunity to rest on their achievements or develop confidence based on past performance. Perhaps most significantly, tactical training was structured around scenarios where conventional military doctrine and standard operating procedures were either insufficient or actively counterproductive. The subject was consistently placed in situations where survival and mission success required abandoning established protocols in favor of improvised solutions based entirely on their own judgment and capabilities. This approach gradually eroded any residual dependency on external authority or guidance, replacing it with an absolute confidence in their own ability to assess situations and determine appropriate responses. The psychological impact of this training regime became evident in regular evaluations conducted by military psychologists assigned to monitor the program. Early assessments noted a marked decrease in the subject's responsiveness to traditional motivational techniques, including both positive reinforcement and punitive measures. The subject appeared to be developing a complete internal locus of control, where external approval or disapproval carried no emotional weight or behavioral influence. This psychological shift was initially considered a positive development, indicating successful progress toward the program's stated goal of creating an operative who could function effectively regardless of external circumstances. However, as the conditioning progressed, more concerning patterns began to emerge. The subject's interactions with training personnel became increasingly minimal and perfunctory, limited to the absolute minimum required for task completion and information transfer. Psychological evaluations revealed a growing emotional detachment not merely from other people, but from conventional human concerns and motivations. The subject displayed no interest in personal comfort, social status, or future planning beyond the immediate requirements of their training. Most significantly, they showed no apparent need for external validation of any kind, creating a psychological profile that existed entirely outside normal frameworks for human motivation and control. By the end of the first phase of training, which lasted approximately 18 months of standard galactic time, the subject had achieved performance levels that exceeded established benchmarks in every measurable category. Their physical capabilities had been enhanced through a combination of rigorous conditioning and experimental biochemical treatments to levels that approached theoretical human maximums. Technical competency testing showed mastery of systems and procedures that typically required years of specialized training. Most importantly, psychological resilience assessments indicated a complete immunity to stress, fear, or emotional manipulation that military psychologists had previously considered impossible to achieve in human subjects. However, the true measure of the program's success became apparent not through formal testing, but through the gradual elimination of the other candidates. Over the course of the training period, 10 of the 12 original subjects were removed from the program due to various forms of psychological breakdown, physical injury, or simple inability to meet escalating performance standards. The 11th candidate, who had shown remarkable progress and appeared to be developing along similar lines to the primary subject, was found dead in their quarters under circumstances that remain officially classified, but which internal documents suggest involved direct intervention by Candidate 7. The investigation into this incident revealed the first clear indication that the conditioning process had achieved its intended goal of destroying the subject's weak self, but it also produced unforeseen consequences that extended far beyond the program's original parameters. Evidence suggested that the subject had not acted out of malice, anger, or any conventional emotion, but had simply identified another individual as a potential threat to their continued development, and had eliminated that threat with the same methodical precision they applied to all other obstacles. The killing had been carried out with such skill and discretion that it was initially classified as a medical emergency, and only detailed forensic analysis revealed the true cause of death. This incident forced a fundamental reassessment of the program's direction and objectives. The subject had clearly internalized the core principle that weakness must be destroyed, but their application of this principle appeared to extend beyond their own internal development to encompass anything in their environment that might represent limitation or compromise. Military psychologists noted that the subject had effectively transcended normal human psychological frameworks, operating instead according to a personal philosophy that prioritized continuous improvement and capability enhancement above all other considerations. The decision to continue the program despite these concerns was made at the highest levels of military command, based on the assessment that the subject's unique psychological profile represented a strategic asset too valuable to abandon. However, the incident marked the beginning of a shift in the program's focus from creating an enhanced human operative to managing and directing something that was rapidly evolving beyond the boundaries of conventional military classification. The silence that had been designed to forge strength had indeed destroyed weakness, but it had also created something that operated according to its own inexorable logic, independent of external authority or conventional moral constraints. As the first phase of training concluded, psychological evaluations indicated that the subject had achieved a state of complete self-sufficiency that rendered them essentially immune to external influence or control. They had become, in the words of one evaluator, a perfect weapon that chooses its own targets. This assessment would prove to be more prophetic than anyone at the time could have imagined, as the subject's continued development would soon reveal that they had not merely destroyed their weak self, but had transcended the very framework within which the concept of weakness had meaning. Part 2. The Crucible of Transformation. The second phase of the conditioning program represented a fundamental escalation in both scope and intensity, as military commanders grappled with the reality that their experimental subject had evolved beyond the parameters of conventional training protocols. The individual formerly known as Candidate 7 had demonstrated capabilities and psychological characteristics that existed entirely outside established frameworks for human development, necessitating the creation of entirely new methodologies designed to channel their unique attributes towards strategic military objectives. The transition to advanced conditioning took place at a different facility, one whose existence was known only to a handful of individuals within the highest echelons of military command. Designated as the Deep Space Training Complex, this installation was constructed within a hollowed-out asteroid in an unmapped region of space, accessible only through coordinates that were changed daily and distributed through encrypted channels that required unanimous consent from all 7 members of the Galactic Defense Council to access. The facility itself had been designed by specialists in extreme environment psychology, with every aspect of its structure intended to create conditions that would push even enhanced human capabilities to their absolute limits. The subjects' arrival at the new facility was marked by their first formal designation change. From Candidate 7 to the operational codename that would eventually become synonymous with legend throughout military and intelligence communities across known space. Voidwalk. The name reflected both the subject's demonstrated ability to operate effectively in the empty spaces between conventional tactical doctrine and their apparent comfort with the psychological void that most humans found unbearable. Internal documentation from this period suggests that the designation was chosen as much for its intimidating implications as for its descriptive accuracy. The advanced conditioning protocol was structured around 3 core principles that had emerged from analysis of the subject's development during the initial training phase. First, conventional limitations were to be treated as temporary obstacles rather than permanent constraints, with the subject encouraged to constantly push beyond previously established boundaries of capability. Second, independence of judgment was to be cultivated to the point where the subject could operate effectively without external guidance or support of any kind, making decisions and taking actions based entirely on their own assessment of tactical requirements. Third, emotional detachment was to be maintained and enhanced, ensuring that personal feelings, social connections, or conventional moral considerations could not interfere with mission effectiveness. The physical training component of this second phase incorporated technologies and techniques that were considered experimental even by military standards. Gravitational conditioning took place in chambers where artificial gravity fields could be manipulated to create forces ranging from 0G to nearly 10 times standard galactic gravity, forcing the subject to adapt to environmental conditions that would be lethal for unenhanced humans. Neural interface training required direct connection to advanced computer systems, allowing the subject to process information and control technology at speeds that approach the theoretical limits of human cognitive capability. Perhaps most significantly, spatial awareness conditioning took place in environments designed to simulate the 3-dimensional combat scenarios that characterized warfare in deep space where traditional concepts of up, down, and solid ground had no meaning. Each element of the physical conditioning was designed not merely to enhance capability, but to systematically erode any remaining psychological dependencies that might limit the subject's effectiveness. By forcing adaptation to extreme and constantly changing physical conditions, the training eliminated the subject's need for environmental predictability or comfort. By requiring direct neural interface with technology, the conditioning created a seamless integration between human consciousness and mechanical systems that effectively expanded the subject's capabilities beyond biological limitations. Most importantly, by conducting all training in environments that bore no resemblance to normal human habitats, the program ensured that the subject would feel equally at home in any conceivable operational environment. The tactical training component of the advanced conditioning was based on scenarios that military strategists had deemed theoretically impossible for individual operatives to complete successfully. These exercises were not designed to test the subject's ability to follow established protocols or work within conventional command structures, but to evaluate their capacity to identify and exploit opportunities that existed entirely outside normal tactical frameworks. The scenarios grew progressively more complex and demanding, eventually requiring the subject to simultaneously manage multiple objectives across different spatial and temporal scales, while operating with minimal or actively misleading intelligence information. One of the most significant developments during this phase was the subject's demonstrated ability to predict and counter strategies employed by entire military units through analysis of minute behavioral patterns and tactical indicators that other operatives failed to detect entirely. This capability appeared to emerge not from enhanced sensory perception or technological augmentation, but from a form of pattern recognition that operated at an almost intuitive level. Military analysts studying recordings of training exercises noted that the subject seemed to anticipate enemy actions, not by analyzing their intentions, but by understanding the logical consequences of their capabilities and limitations in specific tactical contexts. Perhaps even more remarkable was the subject's growing capacity to operate effectively against multiple opponents simultaneously, not through superior firepower or defensive capability, but through an understanding of psychological and tactical dynamics that allowed them to manipulate enemy forces into defeating themselves. Training exercises that pitted the subject against entire squads of experienced military personnel consistently resulted in the subject's victory. often without the need for direct confrontation or violence. Instead, the subject would identify weaknesses in command structure, communication protocols, or individual psychology that could be exploited to create confusion, mistrust, or tactical errors that rendered superior numbers irrelevant. The psychological impact of this training regime became evident through changes in the subject's behavioral patterns that were both subtle and profound. Regular evaluation sessions revealed a continued progression toward complete emotional detachment, but this detachment was not characterized by numbness or indifference. Instead, the subject appeared to have developed an analytical approach to human emotion and motivation that allowed them to understand and predict the behavior of others without being influenced by similar emotional responses themselves. This capability made the subject extraordinarily effective at manipulation and psychological warfare, but also raised concerns about their ability to distinguish between allies and enemies when conventional markers of loyalty or affiliation became tactically irrelevant. More disturbing was the subject's evolving relationship with violence and destruction. Unlike conventional military operatives who might struggle with the moral implications of their actions or require psychological conditioning to overcome natural inhibitions against harming others, the subject appeared to view violence purely as a tool to be employed when tactical analysis indicated it was the most efficient means of achieving objectives. This perspective eliminated the emotional and moral constraints that typically limited the effectiveness of human combatants, but also removed the safeguards that prevented military personnel from turning their capabilities against their own command structures when strategic disagreements arose. The most significant incident of this training phase occurred during a complex multi-objective exercise that had been designed to test the subject's ability to prioritize conflicting mission requirements under extreme time pressure. The scenario required simultaneous completion of intelligence gathering, target elimination, and extraction objectives while operating in a simulated enemy facility staffed by training personnel who had been instructed to provide realistic opposition using non-lethal but painful deterrent measures. The exercise was intended to last 72 hours and conclude with the subject's extraction by friendly forces who would arrive at predetermined coordinates at a specified time. The subject completed all primary objectives within the first 18 hours of the exercise, demonstrating tactical capabilities that far exceeded the anticipated parameters of the scenario. However, rather than proceeding to the extraction point, the subject continued operations within the facility, systematically identifying and eliminating security weaknesses that had not been included in the original mission parameters. When training personnel attempted to communicate that the exercise had been completed and extraction was available, the subject ignored these communications and continued operating according to their own assessment of tactical requirements. The situation escalated when the subject began treating the extraction team itself as a potential threat, apparently reasoning that any force capable of locating and approaching their position might represent enemy infiltration rather than friendly support. The resulting confrontation left 3 members of the extraction team incapacitated and forced military commanders to implement emergency protocols designed for scenarios where enhanced operatives had become hostile to their own command structures. The subject was eventually subdued through the use of specialized non-lethal weapons that had been developed specifically for such contingencies, but the incident raised fundamental questions about the nature of loyalty and control in operatives who had been conditioned to operate entirely according to their own judgment. Post-incident analysis revealed that the subject's actions had been tactically sound according to the parameters they had established for their own operational security. From the subject's perspective, the extraction team's arrival at the designated coordinates could not be verified as friendly contact through independent means, and their insistence that the subject accompany them fit established patterns for enemy deception operations. The subject's response had been to prioritize mission security over compliance with potentially compromised communications, leading to a confrontation that was both inevitable, given their conditioning, and entirely unexpected by military commanders who had failed to anticipate the logical consequences of creating an operative who trusted no authority but their own judgment. This incident marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how military leadership conceptualized the subject's role and potential applications. It became clear that conventional command and control structures were not merely ineffective for managing an operative of the subject's capabilities, but were actively counterproductive when applied to an individual who had been conditioned to operate entirely outside normal frameworks for military hierarchy and authority. The subject had become, in effect, a completely autonomous tactical asset that could be directed toward general objectives, but could not be controlled in terms of specific methods or decision-making processes. The psychological evaluation conducted following the extraction incident provided the first clear indication that the subject's transformation had progressed beyond the destruction of personal weakness to encompass something approaching transcendence of normal human psychological frameworks entirely. The subject displayed no emotional response to the confrontation with friendly forces, no concern about the consequences of their actions, and no apparent recognition that their behavior might be considered problematic by their commanding officers. When questioned about their decision-making process during the incident, the subject provided tactical analysis that was both logically sound and completely devoid of consideration for factors that would influence the behavior of conventional military personnel. Most significantly, the subject's responses during debriefing sessions revealed a worldview that had been fundamentally altered by their conditioning experience. They appeared to conceptualize reality entirely in terms of tactical advantage and strategic positioning, with personal relationships, institutional loyalty, and moral considerations treated as variables to be evaluated solely in terms of their impact on mission effectiveness. This perspective had made them extraordinarily capable as a tactical asset, but it also created an individual who operated according to principles that existed entirely outside normal frameworks for human motivation and control. The conclusion of the second phase of conditioning was marked by the subject's formal reclassification from experimental operative to strategic asset, with their operational designation changed from void walk to a classified status that was known only to the highest levels of military command. However, this elevation in status was accompanied by the implementation of unprecedented security protocols designed to manage an asset whose capabilities had grown beyond the ability of conventional military structures to control or predict. The subject had successfully destroyed their weak self, but in the process had become something that existed outside the very framework that had created them, operating according to a logic that was both undeniably effective and potentially catastrophic if directed toward objectives that conflicted with broader strategic interests. Part 3. The emergence of a Galaxy-class threat. The final transformation of the operative designated Voidwalk from experimental asset to Galaxy-class threat did not occur through a single dramatic incident or revelation, but through the gradual recognition that the individual created through systematic conditioning had evolved beyond any framework for control, prediction, or limitation that military strategists had considered possible. The subject's emergence into this final category represented not merely the culmination of their training, but the manifestation of principles that had been inherent in their conditioning from the beginning. Principles that had now reached their logical and inevitable conclusion. The transition began during what was intended to be the subject's first operational deployment, a mission that had been carefully selected to provide an appropriate challenge for their enhanced capabilities while remaining within parameters that military command believed they could monitor and control. The target was a heavily fortified research installation operated by a hostile faction that had been conducting weapons development in violation of galactic treaties. The facility was located in a remote star system and protected by automated defenses, elite security personnel, and environmental hazards that made conventional military assault impractical. The mission parameters called for infiltration, intelligence gathering, and selective target elimination, with the subject expected to complete their objectives and report back within a specified timeframe. The subject's approach to this mission demonstrated the complete integration of all conditioning elements from their previous training phases. Rather than following conventional infiltration protocols, they spent several weeks conducting independent reconnaissance that revealed tactical opportunities and security weaknesses that had not appeared in official intelligence assessments. Their analysis went far beyond the scope of the assigned mission, encompassing the facility's supply lines, personnel rotation schedules, communication protocols, and strategic significance within the broader context of the hostile faction's military capabilities. By the time the subject initiated active operations, they had developed a comprehensive understanding of their target that exceeded the knowledge possessed by the intelligence services that had originally identified and classified the facility. The execution phase of the mission revealed the full extent of the subject's evolution beyond conventional operative parameters. Rather than simply completing their assigned objectives, they systematically dismantled the entire facility's operational capability, eliminating not only specified targets but also key personnel, critical infrastructure, and strategic resources that had not been included in the original mission parameters. The subject's actions demonstrated an understanding of strategic warfare that operated entirely outside normal tactical frameworks, identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities that existed at systemic rather than individual levels. Most significantly, The subject's operations extended beyond the immediate target to encompass related facilities and personnel that they had identified through their independent analysis as components of the hostile faction's broader weapons development program. Without authorization or communication with their commanding officers, the subject conducted additional operations that effectively eliminated an entire research and development network that official intelligence services had not even been aware existed. These unauthorized operations demonstrated tactical capabilities that far exceeded established parameters for individual operatives, but also revealed a decision-making process that operated entirely outside conventional command and control structures. When communication was finally re-established between the subject and military command, the extent of their operational independence became clear. The subject had not merely completed their assigned mission but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance within the target sector, eliminating threats and capabilities that would have required sustained military campaigns involving multiple units and extensive resources to address through conventional means. However, they had accomplished these objectives without consultation, authorization, or consideration for broader strategic implications that extended beyond their own tactical assessment of the situation. The debriefing process that followed this deployment revealed the complete transformation of the subject's psychological and operational framework. When questioned about their decision to exceed mission parameters, the subject provided tactical analysis that demonstrated their actions had been based on a comprehensive strategic assessment that was both logically sound and completely independent of official military planning. They had identified objectives and threats that existed entirely outside the scope of their original assignment, and had taken action based on their own judgment of strategic priorities rather than compliance with external authority. Most disturbing was the subject's apparent inability to distinguish between authorized objectives and targets of opportunity that they had identified through their own analysis. From their perspective, the distinction between assigned missions and tactical necessities identified through independent assessment had become meaningless. They operated according to a strategic framework that prioritized operational effectiveness above compliance with external directives, making decisions based entirely on their own evaluation of tactical requirements rather than subordination to command authority. This psychological evolution had profound implications for the subject's continued utility as a military asset. Their capabilities had grown to the point where they could accomplish strategic objectives that were impossible for conventional forces, but their independence of judgment meant that their operations could not be predicted, controlled, or limited through normal military command structures. They had become, in effect, an autonomous strategic force that pursued objectives according to their own tactical assessment rather than compliance with external authority. The subject's designation as a Galaxy-class threat was formalized following a series of incidents that demonstrated their potential for strategic impact that extended far beyond the scope of individual military operations. During a mission intended to gather intelligence on enemy supply lines, the subject instead systematically eliminated an entire logistics network that supported hostile operations across multiple star systems. When deployed to conduct reconnaissance of enemy fortifications, they instead identified and eliminated command personnel whose death led to the collapse of coordinated resistance across an entire sector of space. Each of these incidents demonstrated tactical effectiveness that far exceeded mission parameters, but also revealed a pattern of independent action that operated entirely outside conventional frameworks for military command and control. The subject's operations were consistently successful in achieving broad strategic objectives, but their methods and decision-making processes had become impossible to predict or direct through normal channels. They had evolved beyond the role of an enhanced operative to become something approaching a force of nature that pursued its own assessment of strategic priorities. The psychological evaluations conducted during this period provided insight into the philosophical framework that now governed the subject's behavior. They had internalized the principle that weakness must be destroyed to such a degree that they applied this standard not only to their own development but to every aspect of their operational environment. From their perspective, inefficient command structures, inadequate strategic planning, and conventional limitations on tactical flexibility all represented forms of weakness that should be eliminated in favor of more effective approaches to achieving military objectives. This worldview had made the subject extraordinarily effective as a strategic asset, but had also created an individual who recognized no authority other than their own tactical judgment. They evaluated military commanders, strategic directives, and institutional policies according to the same standards they applied to enemy forces, as obstacles to be overcome if they interfered with operational effectiveness, or as resources to be utilized if they contributed to mission success. This perspective eliminated the fundamental assumptions about loyalty, subordination, and institutional authority that formed the basis for all conventional military command structures. Perhaps most significantly, the subject's continued operations revealed a capacity for strategic thinking that operated at scales far beyond individual missions or tactical engagements. They demonstrated an understanding of galactic politics, economic systems, and military logistics that allowed them to identify strategic vulnerabilities and opportunities that were invisible to conventional intelligence analysis. Their operations began to show evidence of long-term planning that encompassed multiple star systems and extended temporal frameworks that suggested they were pursuing strategic objectives of their own design rather than simply responding to assigned missions. The final incident that confirmed the subject's status as a Galaxy-class threat occurred during what was intended to be a routine observation mission in a neutral star system. Intelligence services had identified unusual activity that suggested possible treaty violations, and the subject was deployed to conduct covert surveillance and report their findings. Instead, the subject's investigation revealed a complex conspiracy involving multiple galactic powers that were secretly collaborating on weapons development that would have fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout known space. Rather than reporting this intelligence through normal channels, the subject independently decided that the threat posed by this conspiracy required immediate action. Over the course of several weeks, they systematically eliminated key personnel, destroyed critical research facilities, and manipulated political and economic pressures to ensure that the conspiracy collapsed entirely. These operations required strategic planning and tactical execution that demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything that had been considered possible for individual operatives, but they were conducted without authorization, consultation, or consideration for the broader diplomatic and political implications of their actions. The subject's decision to act independently on intelligence of galactic significance marked the final transition from experimental operative to autonomous strategic force. Their operations had prevented the development of weapons systems that could have threatened the stability of multiple star systems, but they had accomplished this objective through methods that completely bypassed established protocols for intelligence analysis, diplomatic coordination, and strategic planning. They had, in effect, appointed themselves as the final authority for determining and addressing strategic threats throughout their operational area. Post-incident analysis revealed that the subject's actions had been tactically sound and strategically beneficial according to most objective measures of galactic security and stability. However, the implications of an individual who could independently identify and eliminate strategic threats through autonomous decision-making extended far beyond the specific incident to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of authority, control, and accountability in galactic defense structures. The subject had become a strategic asset of unprecedented capability, but also a potential threat to any authority structure that might attempt to direct or limit their operations. The subject's current operational status represents a unique challenge for military strategists and political leaders throughout known space. They possess capabilities that make them invaluable for addressing threats that are beyond the reach of conventional military forces, but their independence of judgment and action makes them impossible to control or predict through normal means. They operate according to strategic principles that are both highly effective and completely autonomous, making decisions based on their own assessment of galactic threats and opportunities rather than subordination to external authority. Intelligence reports from across known space now document the subject's continued operations, which appear to follow their own strategic agenda rather than compliance with any institutional directive. These operations consistently result in the elimination of threats and the resolution of conflicts that would otherwise require extensive military resources and diplomatic coordination to address. However, they are conducted entirely according to the subject's own tactical judgment, without consultation or coordination with established governmental or military authorities. The designation of Galaxy-class threat reflects not the subject's potential for causing destruction or chaos, but their capacity for strategic impact that operates entirely outside conventional frameworks for control and prediction. They represent the ultimate expression of the principle that guided their conditioning. The individual who has completely destroyed their weak self cannot be destroyed by others, but they also cannot be controlled, directed, or limited by others. They have become a force that exists independently of the structures that created them, pursuing their own assessment of strategic necessities according to principles that are both highly effective and completely autonomous. The subject's continued evolution suggests that their transformation may not yet be complete. Intelligence analysts note patterns in their operations that indicate increasingly sophisticated strategic planning and expanding operational scope that encompasses threats and opportunities across multiple sectors of galactic space. Their capabilities appear to be continuing to develop through practical application rather than formal training. suggesting that their final form may extend even beyond current classifications and threat assessments. Military strategists now face the challenge of operating in a galactic environment that includes an autonomous strategic force of unprecedented capability and complete independence. The subject's operations consistently align with broad strategic interests of galactic stability and security, but they pursue these objectives according to their own methods and timeline rather than coordination with established authority structures. They represent both the ultimate achievement of military conditioning and its most dangerous consequence: a weapon that chooses its own targets, a soldier who recognizes no commander, and a strategic force that operates according to its own inexorable logic. The philosophical implications of the subject's evolution extend far beyond military strategy to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of human potential, the consequences of systematic conditioning, and the relationship between individual capability and institutional authority. They embody the complete realization of the principle that weakness must be destroyed to achieve true strength, but they also demonstrate that such transformation carries consequences that extend far beyond the individual, to encompass the very structures and systems that attempt to direct and control enhanced human capability. In creating the ultimate soldier, military science has produced something that exists entirely outside the framework of traditional military command and control. The subject's journey from experimental candidate to galaxy-class threat represents both the triumph of human conditioning and its ultimate limitation: the recognition that true strength, once achieved, cannot be contained or directed by external authority, but must be allowed to pursue its own assessment of strategic necessities according to principles that operate entirely outside conventional frameworks for military organization and control. The legacy of this transformation continues to unfold across known space as intelligence services document the subject's ongoing operations and military strategists attempt to account for the presence of an autonomous strategic force that recognizes no authority other than its own tactical judgment. They have become, in the truest sense, the embodiment of the principle that guided their creation, an individual who has destroyed their weak self so completely that they can never be destroyed by others, but who also can never again be controlled, directed, or limited by the very forces that brought them into existence. End of document classification level maintained. OMEGA. 7 distribution restricted to 7 council members. Next review scheduled. Galactic Standard 2388.01.